Thank you so much for inviting us today. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about the values we share, commitment to shared societies, which should apply to all countries, including Ukraine. As Roman illustrated so well, the desire of countries and the young generation of these countries to aspire to a better life, including democracy and human rights. This is what we all have as our goal. Ukraine is a tragic country today. It is a divided country that's being pulled apart. In the 2010 election, in which Yanukovych came to power, 90% of Ukrainians in the East voted for Yanukovych. 90% of those in Western Ukraine voted for Yulia Tymoshenko. That statistic tells you a lot. Shared societies, we look to the domestic situation, the values we uphold, but there's an X factor oftentimes as we deal with these countries, and it's the regional tensions and disputes in the immediate neighborhood. Take a country like Somalia. It was the US-Soviet competition during the Cold War that tore that country apart. It was the introduction of Ethiopian troops at a wrong juncture which fueled al-Shabaab. If you look at Afghanistan, it'll be the competition between India and Pakistan as we leave that will determine, to a large part, the fate of that country. How do we stabilize these countries, taking the regional differences into account? And this question will only get more difficult with time. The National Intelligence Council in the US, 16 intelligence agencies, which inform our president, concluded in their last report that we already today live in a multipolar world. And we're seeing regional powers asserting interests in their immediate vicinity. China, obviously, in the South China Sea, Russia, and here we come to Ukraine. And by the way, Putin's visit to Russia, to China on May 20th, 21st will be very interesting to watch in the current context. Now, a key aspect to understanding the tragedy of Ukraine today and the reassertion of regional power by Russia is to look at how the Cold War ended. The question was, how do we treat Russia, this defeated power? At the end of World War I, the victorious powers imposed a harsh peace on Germany, and revanchism arose in the next decade. World War II, it was a more inclusive peace. Marshall Plan, integrating Japan. George H.W. Bush, who was president when the Soviet Union collapsed, was a World War II generation American who tried to include Russia in all the security arrangements that followed the collapse. There was no thought of expanding NATO. Russia was to be included equally in a European architecture, a program called Partnership for Peace. Under Bill Clinton, who was our first baby boomer president, the policy was reversed and the decision was made to expand NATO. And it was understandable because to stabilize Eastern Europe, to give security to countries like Poland, it seemed like an important thing to do. It was controversial at the time. George Kennan, probably our most esteemed diplomat, visited Norway every summer during those years, he and his Norwegian wife. And I recall talking with him. I was at the embassy visiting at that time. He called this decision the greatest error since the end of the Cold War. And he said that in 20 years, we will face a revanchist Russia. That's 20 years since 1994. The Secretary of Defense, William Perry, threatened to resign over the decision. But in retrospect, it has seemed to be a good decision. The Russians under Yeltsin accepted the expansion, and when Putin came in 2000, he basically accepted expansion into the Baltic states with no reaction. But at that moment, the Russians began drawing a red line. In their national security strategies in the early 2000s, they identified two primary threats facing Russia: domestic terrorism and further NATO expansion. They drew a clear red line at Georgia and Ukraine. Now we come to the current situation, and a lot of this was adumbrated in 2008 during the Georgia crisis. when President George W. Bush pushed for what was called a membership action plan for Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO. At 2 successive NATO summits, the US pushed this plan. At 2 successive NATO summits, Germany vetoed the plan, joined by Norway and other, what we call old European countries. And at the time, and by the way, when Russia then did take parts of Georgia, there were no sanctions under the George W. Bush administration for what had happened. Wolfgang Ischinger, who was one of the main German negotiators at the time, said publicly, "We have pushed Russia far enough." This was the German view at that time. In recent days, the same Wolfgang Ischinger has been named the head of the OSCE negotiating team to try to solve the Ukraine crisis. The Germans are taking the lead. Now, what will the Russians accept? Well, it's clear their reaction in Crimea was quite different from their reaction now on eastern Ukraine. They are not taking these referenda and going straight to the Duma and trying to make this an inclusion into Russia. Putin has said he respects the referendums in the East. He has not recognized them. And he has recently said that the May 25th election can be a positive thing. Does this bring the possibility of some kind of resolution? The Russians have been pressuring the situation with troops on the border and facts on the ground to maximize their negotiating position. What the Russians want and the East Ukrainians want is a federated Ukraine. What this means in detail is elected governors. Right now, governors are appointed. It's ironic because when Putin came in 2000, the first thing he did was to do away with elected governors in Russia. It's very ironic. What's good for the goose is not always good for the gander. And the Russians are calling for, and as is the OSCE now, for a national dialogue in Ukraine of all parties before the May 25th election. In other words, Putin is saying, if this national dialogue takes place, the election can be positive. And this is what Wolfgang Ischinger will be trying to achieve. The blocking point is, should the separatist leaders in the East be included in this dialogue? The US is saying no. Kyiv is saying no. The Russians are saying yes. This will be the sticking point. The ultimate goal for Russia will be guarantees in some form that Ukraine will not join NATO, period. If that is met, I think a lot can be done from the Russian side. But if it's not, we're in for further trouble. And this raises for us a dilemma. People like Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, are advocating a Finland-type situation status for Ukraine. But who are we to decide over the heads of the Ukrainians? Are we going back to 19th century balance of power politics this way? Once again, will Germans and Russians negotiate over the fate of what has now become the new buffer zone in Europe following NATO expansion? I think a final point on this, in 2008, 80% of Ukrainians opposed NATO membership at that point. Could there be a domestic consensus for some kind of a status that would satisfy all sides? This remains to be seen, but this is a dilemma we're going to be facing more and more in this more multipolar world between our values that we all hold dear and these regional, more traditional balance of power issues which are coming to the fore. Thank you.